please join with me in the spirit of prayer? May the words of my mouth, the meditations of all our hearts, be acceptable and pleasing to you, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Years ago, I worked as a software developer. And as much as I enjoyed studying computer science as a student, when I got into the real world, something had changed. I was able to get comfortable jobs that paid very well, but after a while, I was left unhappy. It got to the point where I could no longer bring myself to do the work anymore. I had originally planned on going towards a doctorate in computer science and going on to teach. But my experience in the workforce left me wondering if this was really the right path for me. After working in the field a couple years, I went back to teaching as an adjunct. It was rewarding work, but it wasn't sustainable. Higher education in this country has become something of a nightmare, where students are accumulating obscene amounts of debt as the cost of textbooks and tuition skyrockets. Universities have begun to rely more and more on part-time contingent faculty to cut costs. Many qualified instructors find themselves having to take 2 or 3 part-time positions at different universities just to make ends meet. I was working at 2 schools, teaching 3 classes, and doing private tutoring on the side, and barely getting by. I had no health insurance or other benefits. If I got sick, I would take Dayquil and go in anyway, because if I canceled a class, the school would take it out of my paycheck. Work was scarce in the summer, and my partner and I would have to watch our budget very carefully to get through. In spite of all that, I was much happier. I was helping people learn and hopefully build better lives for themselves. And I continued that work until my devotion to God and to the church led me to seminary. Devotion seems to be the common theme in today's readings. Our reading from the Acts of the Apostles offers a picture of extreme devotion of the early church community. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. In the epistle reading, we find a difficult message. To endure unjust suffering is to follow Christ's example. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And shepherds are also prominent in today's readings. And there are few jobs that require as much selfless devotion as being a good shepherd and caring for truly helpless sheep. It also seems fitting that these readings happen to fall on Mother's Day. Good mothers know something about true devotion and caring for those most vulnerable. But if I focus on shepherds and sheep, I'd be ignoring the elephant in the room. And today's reading from Acts of the Apostles is a rather large elephant. How can we begin to make sense of it? It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. The early church was a gathering of people who found something meaningful, something they could devote their lives to. Something about the gospel message grasped them. We're told that they were filled with awe at the signs and wonders being done by the apostles. And then we come to something truly remarkable. It says, all who believed were together and held all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. Bible commentators have danced around this passage, and a similar passage in chapter 4, verses 32 through 35, which reads, "Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands and houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need." Why do we find these passages so difficult? Is it because it's too unrealistic? Some commentators have dismissed these passages as an overly idealistic portrayal of the early church. And yet, this is a church that believes in a God made flesh, born of a virgin who conceived through the power of the Holy Spirit, a God who died a horrible death by crucifixion, then was raised from the dead and ascended to heaven. I simply do not understand why anyone who is capable of believing something as remarkable as resurrection finds something like the description of the early church so incredible. Do we find this passage difficult because we think people are inherently too selfish and individualistic? I don't think that's the case either. We see acts of charity and cooperation abound. We only have to take the time to look for them. And this isn't to say that there aren't selfish and corrupt people. If we keep reading Acts, we encounter such people in chapter 5, and God deals harshly with them. Whether or not God actually struck people dead for lying to the apostles, the story shows us that the early church was far from utopian. Some people caused problems, overstepped boundaries, and made things difficult for others. Not just in Acts, but much of the New Testament, especially the letters of Paul, attest to the problems facing the early church. What then is it about this story that makes us so uncomfortable? Perhaps there is something in our own individualism, our desire to be self-sufficient, that makes surrendering everything to any cause, even to the cause of Christ, downright terrifying. Perhaps we are afraid of finding ourselves in a situation where we have to rely on the help of others to sustain ourselves. Perhaps our pride gets in the way. In this country, we are taught that we're supposed to be able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, work hard, and live out the American dream that has brought so many people to this country. But the American dream is aptly named because we inevitably wake up from it, and the reality can be harsh. But just imagine for a moment what would happen if we took this passage from Acts seriously. If, instead of being inhibited by the fears of scarcity and drives for self-protection, we devoted ourselves in the same way the early church did. What would this look like? Let me put it another way. What if we measured success not in what a person's income is, but in how many other people's lives they managed to make better? What if working mothers, fathers didn't have to worry about how they were going to feed their families or pay rent if they got ill? What if students were free to pursue studies and careers without accumulating more debt than some of them can ever hope to pay off in their lifetime? Can you imagine what the world might look like if we were free to devote our lives to something as wonderful as this? If we weren't so caught up in survival and scarcity? What if we devoted our lives to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers? Fellowship with devotion would become something so much more than a coffee hour or a potluck or a Sunday dinner. We heard in the gospel reading today that Jesus is the gate for the sheep, who calls the sheep by name and they know his voice. Immediately after this passage, John chapter 10, verses 11 to 13, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because he is a hired hand and does not care for the sheep. The good shepherd and the hired hand illustrate the difference between being completely devoted to a cause and being only interested in personal gain. As many of you are aware, one of my class projects was a social analysis of Broadway UCC. I spoke with a number of you about what this community values and what brings people here, in hopes of getting a better understanding of how we function and how we can be of better service to the community. Broadway is a remarkable church community with deep concern for social and economic justice and for the well-being of those belonging to and served by this church. Both the shared meal after worship and the 93rd Street sandwich line attest to this. There is a strong emphasis on the value of adult religious education, which is evidenced by the number and quality of classes offered on a near constant basis. This church is a welcoming place, bringing together people from all means and backgrounds. And yet, there is a real need for greater participation in this and other forms of service. For people to move from a place of deep concern to devoted service. There is a need to take the bottom portion of the pledge card seriously. Whether or not you donate money, your time and talent is invaluable. The nature of that involvement is up to you. Perhaps there are other causes that you are passionate about, that you would devote yourself to advancing and to bringing to this church. It could be LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, affordable housing, ecology, fighting racism and sexism in all its forms, prison reform, workers' rights, reproductive rights. I could go on. As Christians, we are all called to ministry. And in the words of Frederick Buechner, the place God calls you to is where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I am a Christian because I believe in God that works beyond our fears of scarcity and creates abundance. a God manifest in the person of Jesus, who feeds the multitudes and brings liberation to the oppressed, who overturns the tables of the money changers, who called poor fishermen to follow him, who told a rich would-be follower to sell everything he had and give it to the poor. I am also a socialist because I believe that food, housing, healthcare, education, and employment are basic human rights that can never be fully realized under capitalism. It is not my intention to convince you of this last point here, but I hope that you recognize that my faith informs my political and economic beliefs and not the other way around. I am a Christian before I am a socialist. When you truly devote yourselves to a cause, the sacrifices you make will seem worthwhile. In September of 2011, when people began to gather in Zuccotti Park to occupy Wall Street, many of them left homes and families because they saw how debt, poverty, and economic disparity are ruining lives. Many of them had neither home nor family to leave and came to Zuccotti Park to find both. It was a community that had its problems, and some of them very serious, and I don't want to romanticize what happened. At the same time, it was an example of what happens to people when they devote their lives to a cause and live in fellowship. This is my last Sunday as your seminary intern. My challenge to you this day is to think deeply and prayerfully how each of you can devote your lives to the gospel and to the future of the church. Listen for how God is speaking to you. Ask yourselves and ask others, to what are you being called? Remember that when our worship ends, our service